I knew the ice storm was coming when the temperature dropped 30 degrees in 6 hours, but I never expected it would turn my quiet life in Ridgefield, Connecticut, into a nightmare orchestrated by the most vindictive woman I'd ever met. My name is Lucas Lancaster, and I've lived in the Pinewood Estates subdivision for 8 years. It's one of those upscale neighborhoods where everyone keeps their lawns pristine and their holiday decorations tasteful. I'm a logistics coordinator for a regional distribution company, which means I understand supply chains better than most people. That knowledge is exactly what saved me during the ice storm of February 2025, and exactly what made me a target for Brenda Whitmore, the HOA president, who thought she owned every blade of grass and grain of salt in our neighborhood. The weather forecast had been screaming warnings for 3 days. A massive Arctic front was colliding with moisture from the Atlantic, and meteorologists predicted the worst ice storm Connecticut had seen in decades. I'd been through enough New England winters to know that preparation meant survival. On the Tuesday before the storm hit, I drove to 3 different hardware stores, 2 home improvement centers, and even crossed state lines into New York to stock up on supplies. My garage ended up housing 40 bags of ice melt, 15 bags of rock salt, 3 snow shovels, 2 ice scrapers with extended handles, backup batteries, flashlights, and enough canned food to last 2 weeks. My neighbors thought I was paranoid. Tom and Jennifer across the street waved as I unloaded my 5th trip, calling out something about building a bunker. I just smiled and kept working. The storm was projected to hit Thursday evening, and I wanted everything ready. Wednesday afternoon, I was organizing my garage when I heard the clicking of heels on my driveway. I turned to find Brenda Whitmore standing there with her tablet clutched to her chest like a shield. She was 52, stick-thin with blonde highlights that looked more silver in the winter light, and she wore her HOA president title like a crown. Her perfectly pressed pantsuit seemed absurd given the dropping temperature and gray clouds gathering overhead. "Lucas," she said, her voice sharp as the wind picking up around us, "I couldn't help but notice you've been stockpiling quite extensively. Just preparing for the storm, Brenda. You should do the same." Her eyes narrowed as she peered into my garage, taking inventory of my supplies. "That's rather excessive for one person, don't you think? The HOA has protocols for community emergencies. I'm not aware of any protocols that prevent homeowners from preparing for natural disasters," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Brenda had a talent for turning casual conversations into violations that somehow required fines. "The HOA board believes in community cooperation during times of crisis," she continued, tapping something into her tablet. "With that much salt and ice melt, you could clear the entire neighborhood." I felt a warning prickle at the base of my neck. I bought these supplies with my own money for my own property, the driveway, walkway, and the sidewalk in front of my house. The bylaws state that homeowners must contribute to the common good of the community. She looked up from her tablet with that particular smile she used when she thought she'd trapped someone. "I'll be in touch about organizing a supply distribution system." She left before I could respond, her heels clicking away like a countdown timer. I stood there in my garage, staring at my carefully accumulated supplies, and felt the first real sense of dread that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. Thursday morning arrived with an eerie stillness. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees, and the sky hung low and gray like a bruise. I worked from home that day, keeping one eye on my laptop and the other on the weather radar. The storm was going to be worse than predicted. The National Weather Service had upgraded it to a severe ice storm warning, with accumulations of up to 2 inches of ice expected. Power outages were almost guaranteed. At 2 in the afternoon, my phone rang. It was an automated message from the HOA. Brenda's voice, artificially cheerful, announced an emergency community meeting at 5 o'clock at the community center. Attendance was strongly encouraged. I deleted the message. There was no way I was leaving my house with freezing rain already starting to fall. By 4 o'clock, the world outside had transformed into a crystal prison. Every surface gleamed with ice. Trees bent under the weight, their branches already beginning to snap with sounds like gunshots. The power flickered twice, and I heard the distant crack of a transformer blowing somewhere in the neighborhood. My house went dark, except for the backup lights I'd set up. I'd plugged in my phone, laptop, and all my devices to the portable power station I'd charged fully the night before. At 5:30, someone pounded on my front door. I looked through the peephole to see Brenda standing there, incredibly, in the same pantsuit but with a heavy coat thrown over it. Her car was running in my driveway, headlights cutting through the freezing rain. I opened the door a crack. "Are you insane? You drove in this." The meeting was mandatory, Lucas. You didn't attend. Ice crystals were forming in her hair. "I need to discuss the supply distribution plan." "Brenda, go home. This is dangerous." The HOA board has voted. All homeowners with excess emergency supplies must contribute to a community pool. We'll distribute them fairly to all residents. I stared at her, genuinely unsure if I was hearing correctly. "You want me to give you the supplies I bought with my own money? The community needs them. Mrs. Henderson is elderly and has no salt. The Pattersons have a new baby. Your hoarding is unacceptable during a crisis." "I'm not hoarding. I'm prepared. There's a difference. And you need to leave before you get hurt out here." Her face flushed red despite the cold. "If you don't comply, there will be consequences. The bylaws are very clear about community cooperation. Show me the specific bylaw that says I have to give you my private property." She jabbed her tablet toward me, but I could see her hands shaking from cold. Section 12, subsection 4. Community welfare during emergency situations. That section talks about not blocking emergency vehicles and maintaining clear pathways. It says nothing about confiscating personal supplies. "Now go home, Brenda." I closed the door. Through the peephole, I watched her stand there for a full minute, her face contorting with rage, before she finally stalked back to her car. She nearly fell twice on my icy driveway, and part of me wanted to go help her. But I knew any assistance would be seen as weakness or admission of fault. The storm raged all night. I woke up Friday morning to a world encased in ice 2 inches thick. My street looked like a scene from a disaster movie. Power lines sagged under the weight, several already snapped and dangling. Tree branches littered every yard, some as thick as my leg. The entire neighborhood was without power except for the houses with generators, and I could hear several of those rumbling in the distance. I spent the morning clearing my driveway and walkway. It was brutal work. The ice had bonded to everything, and even with my stockpile of ice melt, it took 3 hours to make my property safely navigable. I also cleared the public sidewalk in front of my house, as required by city ordinance. By noon, I was exhausted but satisfied. My property was safe and accessible. That's when I noticed the rest of the neighborhood. Most driveways were still completely iced over. Cars were trapped under inches of ice. People were slipping and sliding just trying to get their mail. And there, in the middle of the cul-de-sac, was Brenda's Mercedes, stuck at an angle where she'd apparently slid off her own driveway trying to leave that morning. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Brenda Whitmore. Emergency HOA meeting at my house, 3 p.m. today. Your attendance is mandatory per bylaw 7.2. I texted back. Roads are impassable and dangerous. Meetings should be postponed. Her response came immediately. I've contacted everyone. They're coming. So should you unless you want additional violations. I looked out at the ice-covered streets and shook my head. There was no way I was risking my safety for one of Brenda's power plays. I went back inside and made lunch, watching through my window as, incredibly, people actually started showing up at Brenda's house. I recognized Tom and Jennifer from across the street, sliding and stumbling up Brenda's driveway. The Millers from 2 houses down in their SUV, crawling along at 5 miles per hour. Even old Mrs. Henderson, who had to be helped by 2 neighbors, shuffling across the ice. At 3:15, Brenda called me directly. Where are you? At home, where any sensible person should be during an ice storm. Everyone else managed to make it. We're discussing your refusal to share community resources. My private property isn't a community resource, Brenda. We're voting on an emergency assessment. Every household will contribute supplies or pay into a fund to purchase them for those in need. You can't just make up rules, Brenda. That's not how HOAs work. Any assessment has to follow proper procedures with written notice and a formal vote following the bylaws. This is an emergency situation. The bylaws allow for emergency measures. Show me where specifically in the bylaws. Email me the section. I'll wait. She hung up. 10 minutes later, I received an email with a scanned section of the HOA bylaws. It was Section 18, subsection 2, which discussed emergency board powers. I read it carefully, then read it again. It did allow the board to take emergency actions, but those actions had to be ratified by a homeowner vote within 30 days, and they had to be reasonable and necessary for the immediate safety of residents. Confiscating private property definitely didn't fall under that umbrella. I called my lawyer friend Marcus, who lived in New Haven. He was a real estate attorney who'd helped me with my house purchase years ago. Lucas, I'm surprised you have cell service, he said when he answered. Generator keeping my router alive. Marcus, can an HOA force homeowners to surrender private property during an emergency? He laughed, then realized I was serious. No, absolutely not. That would be an illegal taking. Why? I explained the situation. He was quiet for a moment, then I heard him typing. Send me your HOA bylaws. All of them. And document everything Brenda says or does. Every interaction, every demand, time stamped if possible. You think this is going to escalate? Lucas, she drove to your house during an ice storm to demand your salt. Yes, I think it's going to escalate. He was right. Saturday morning, I found a notice taped to my front door. It was an official HOA violation notice, stating that I had failed to attend a mandatory meeting and had refused to comply with emergency community protocols. The fine was $500, due within 15 days. I photographed the notice, emailed it to Marcus, and then did something I probably shouldn't have. I posted it on the Pinewood Estates community Facebook page with a simple caption. Fined for not giving away my private property. Is this legal? The response was immediate and explosive. Within an hour, there were 50 comments. Some people supported Brenda, saying I was selfish for not sharing. But most people were outraged, especially when I posted the specific bylaw Brenda claimed authorized her actions and asked anyone to explain how it justified confiscating personal supplies. Tom from across the street commented, Wait, she wanted you to just give her your stuff. I thought we were just discussing community preparedness. Jennifer added, Brenda told us Lucas was hoarding supplies meant for the community center. She said he'd taken them from the HOA shed. That lit a fire in my chest. I responded immediately. That is absolutely false. I purchased every item from retail stores with my own money. I have receipts. Brenda is lying. The thread exploded. People started sharing their own stories of Brenda's overreach. Fines for mailboxes being the wrong shade of black. Violations for Christmas decorations being up one day too long. A family threatened with legal action because their 7-year-old's chalk drawings on their own driveway were unsightly. By evening, someone had created a separate Facebook group called Pinewood Estates HOA Reform. It had 30 members within the first hour, nearly a third of the neighborhood. Sunday morning brought a thaw. Temperatures rose to 40 degrees and the ice began to melt. Power was restored to most of the neighborhood by noon. I spent the day documenting my supplies, photographing every bag of salt with its receipt, creating a spreadsheet showing purchase dates, locations, and costs. Total expenditure, $2,347. Monday, I received a certified letter. It was from Brenda in her capacity as HOA president, officially demanding that I surrender all ice melt and salt supplies to the HOA for fair distribution to community members in need, and informing me that failure to comply would result in legal action. I called Marcus immediately. She's actually threatening to sue me. Let her. Lucas, this is the stupidest thing I've seen an HOA do in 15 years of practice, and I've seen some monumentally stupid things. If she sues, she'll lose, and you might have grounds for a countersuit. For what? Harassment, abuse of power, possibly defamation if she's been telling people you stole community property. How do you want to handle this? I want to respond officially through you. Make it clear I'm not backing down. Marcus drafted a response that afternoon. It was beautiful in its precision, citing case law and Connecticut statutes about property rights, HOA limitations, and the legal definition of emergency powers. It concluded by demanding Brenda retract her accusations and waive the $500 fine, or I would be forced to take legal action against both her personally and the HOA. We sent it via certified mail and email. Brenda's response came within 2 hours. She doubled the fine to $1,000 for continued defiance of HOA authority and gave me 48 hours to comply or face a lien on my property. That was a mistake. You can't just place a lien on someone's property without following legal procedures, and threatening to do so is actually illegal in Connecticut. Marcus's next letter informed Brenda that she had just committed lien fraud, a criminal offense, and that we would be reporting her actions to the State Attorney General's office if she didn't immediately cease all harassment. Wednesday morning, I was served with a lawsuit. Brenda, representing the Pinewood Estates HOA board, was suing me for $10,000 in damages, claiming that my refusal to share supplies during the ice storm had caused harm to community members. The complaint listed several specific allegations. Mrs. Henderson had fallen on her icy walkway and bruised her hip because she had no ice melt. The Pattersons' pipes had frozen because they couldn't clear ice from their basement vents. 3 families had been unable to leave their homes for 2 days due to impassable driveways. I sat in my kitchen reading the lawsuit and felt something shift inside me. Brenda had crossed a line. This wasn't just HOA pettiness anymore. She was trying to destroy me financially over salt. Marcus read the complaint and actually laughed. This is going to get dismissed so fast. But since she's filed, we need to respond properly. Are you ready for this to get expensive? How expensive? Legal fees could run $10,000 to $15,000 if it goes to trial. But Lucas, I think we can get her to drop this and possibly recover your costs. The suit is completely without merit. Let's do it. And Marcus, I want to countersue. We filed our response 2 weeks later. It was a masterpiece. We didn't just deny her allegations, we systematically destroyed them. Mrs. Henderson's fall happened on her own property, which she was responsible for maintaining, and we had documentation that the city had declared the ice storm a state of emergency, meaning homeowners couldn't be held liable for ice-related accidents during that period. The Pattersons' frozen pipes were due to inadequate insulation, not ice on their vents. The three families who couldn't leave their homes had the same access to stores as I did before the storm and made their own choices about preparation. Then we filed our countersuit. We sued Brenda personally and the HOA for harassment, abuse of power, defamation, attempted illegal taking of property, and threatening fraudulent liens. We asked for $25,000 in damages plus legal fees. The neighborhood erupted. The HOA Reform Facebook group now had 53 members. People started digging into HOA finances and discovered some interesting irregularities. Brenda had spent $8,000 in HOA funds on beautification that consisted mainly of plants around her own property. She'd authorized herself a monthly administrative stipend of $300 that wasn't in the original bylaws. She'd hired her brother's landscaping company for all community maintenance at rates 30% higher than competitors. Someone called for a special election to remove the entire board. The bylaws allowed this if 25 homeowners signed a petition. Within 3 days, 37 signatures were collected. Brenda fought back by declaring the petition invalid due to procedural irregularities, but that just made people angrier. A homeowner named Patricia Mills, a retired paralegal, started attending board meetings with a recording device and posting the recordings online. They revealed Brenda's contempt for the residents, her authoritarian approach to governance, and her open admission that she'd been trying to make an example of me to keep other homeowners in line. The lawsuit crawled through the system. Discovery was particularly brutal for Brenda. We requested all HOA communications regarding me, all financial records, and all documentation of the emergency protocols she claimed authorized her actions. What we received was a mess of incomplete records, missing receipts, and email chains that showed Brenda had been planning to target me specifically for months before the ice storm. In one email to another board member, she wrote, "Lucas Lancaster thinks he's smarter than the HOA. We need to find a way to bring him to heel before his independence spreads to other homeowners." Marcus highlighted that email in neon yellow. This is consciousness of guilt. She wasn't acting in the community's interest. She was targeting you personally. The deposition was scheduled for late April. I sat in a conference room in a law office in Stamford and watched Brenda squirm under Marcus's questioning for 4 hours. She contradicted herself repeatedly, couldn't provide documentation for most of her claims, and finally admitted under oath that no other homeowner had been fined or threatened for not sharing their ice storm supplies. So Mr. Lancaster was singled out, Marcus asked. He had more supplies than anyone else, Brenda snapped, and that made him obligated to share them. The community needed them. Did the community pay for them? Well, no, but did the HOA bylaws at the time of the ice storm contain any provision requiring homeowners to surrender private property during emergencies? Brenda's lawyer objected, but she'd already started answering. The spirit of the bylaws. Yes or no, Mrs. Whitmore? Did the bylaws contain such a provision? Not explicitly, but thank you. No further questions. My deposition was shorter. I provided receipts, photographs, timestamps, and a clear narrative. I'd prepared for a disaster using my own resources. I'd maintained my property and the public sidewalk as required by law. I'd offered to sell salt to neighbors at cost if they needed it after the storm, but no one had taken me up on it, because by then the stores were restocked. You offered to sell it at cost. Brenda's lawyer jumped on that. Not to give it away. I spent over $2,000 on those supplies. I don't think it's unreasonable to recoup my costs if I'm helping others. But in an emergency, shouldn't community members help each other? I did help. I cleared my sidewalk, which benefited everyone walking by. I checked on my neighbors after the storm. I offered supplies at no profit, but I'm not required to bankrupt myself for everyone else's lack of preparation. The special election happened in May. Every board member, including Brenda, was removed and replaced. The new president was Patricia Mills, who immediately began an audit of HOA finances and suspended all pending violations while bylaws were reviewed. The lawsuit was scheduled for trial in June, but it never got that far. In late May, Marcus received a settlement offer. The HOA would drop all claims against me and pay $15,000 for my legal fees and damages. In exchange, I would drop my countersuit. What about Brenda personally? I asked. She's protected by the HOA's insurance as long as she was acting in her official capacity. We could pursue her individually, but it would be expensive and difficult to collect. The insurance company wants this to go away, and they're willing to pay to make that happen. I thought about it. $15,000 would cover Marcus's fees, reimburse my supply costs, and leave me with a decent amount for my trouble. More importantly, it would send a message to every HOA in Connecticut that you can't just make up rules and steal people's property. I'll take it on one condition. Brenda has to resign from the board, and the settlement has to include a clause preventing her from holding any HOA position for 5 years. Marcus negotiated it. Brenda fought, but the HOA's insurance company put pressure on her. They'd reviewed the case and realized they were going to lose badly at trial. Either she resigned, or they'd deny coverage and leave her to face my countersuit alone. She resigned on June 3rd. The settlement was finalized on June 10th. I received a check for $15,000 and a written apology from the HOA acknowledging that I had not violated any bylaws and that the violations issued against me were invalid. The story didn't end there. Patricia Mills's audit revealed that Brenda had misappropriated over $30,000 in HOA funds over 3 years. The new board voted to refer the matter to the Ridgefield Police Department. In August, Brenda was arrested for embezzlement and fraud. The charges included theft of HOA funds, fraudulent billing, and creating false documents. I watched from my window as 2 police officers led her out of her house in handcuffs. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. Her husband filed for divorce 2 weeks later, and her house went up for sale in September. The criminal trial happened in November. I was called as a witness to testify about the timeline of events and Brenda's attempts to extort my property. The prosecutor used our civil lawsuit as evidence of Brenda's pattern of abuse of authority. She was convicted on 4 counts of embezzlement and 2 counts of fraud. The judge sentenced her to 18 months in prison, 3 years of probation, and ordered her to make full restitution to the HOA. Standing in that courtroom, listening to the sentence, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. I hadn't wanted to destroy Brenda's life. I just wanted her to leave me alone and respect my property rights. But she'd made choice after choice that led her to this moment. The salt had just been the catalyst that exposed what she'd been doing all along. The new HOA board completely rewrote the bylaws. They established clear limits on board authority, required quarterly financial reports, banned all nepotistic hiring, and created an appeals process for violations. They also added a specific clause clarifying that homeowners could not be required to surrender private property under any circumstances. My neighbors' attitudes shifted too. People started preparing better for winter weather. The following January, when another ice storm was forecast, I noticed at least a dozen homeowners stocking up on salt and supplies. Tom from across the street even asked me for recommendations on the best ice melt brands. The HOA Reform Facebook group became a permanent fixture, rebranded as the Pinewood Estates Community Forum. It's still active, with residents sharing information, organizing neighborhood events, and keeping watch over HOA decisions. Patricia Mills jokes that Brenda accidentally created the most engaged and informed HOA membership in Connecticut. I still live in Ridgefield, still in the same house in Pinewood Estates. My garage still gets stocked with salt and ice melt every winter, though I've scaled back from 40 bags. I learned something important through all of this. Standing up to unreasonable authority is expensive, stressful, and time-consuming, but sometimes it's absolutely necessary. The $15,000 settlement paid for Marcus's work and reimbursed my costs, but the real victory was seeing the community take back control from someone who viewed power as a weapon rather than a responsibility. Brenda's house eventually sold to a young couple with twin toddlers. They're nice people who have never once demanded anyone's salt. Every winter, when the first snow falls and I'm spreading ice melt on my driveway, I think about that February ice storm and everything that came after. I think about Brenda's face when she stood on my porch demanding my supplies, absolutely certain she had the authority to take them. I think about the moment in her deposition when she realized she was going to lose. I think about the police leading her away in handcuffs. But mostly, I think about all the homeowners who have told me their stories since then. People who were fined unfairly, harassed over minor violations, or bullied into compliance with rules that didn't actually exist. People who thought they had no choice but to submit to HOA authority, no matter how unreasonable. The story spread beyond Ridgefield. Local news covered the criminal trial, and suddenly, I was getting calls from reporters asking about HOA abuses. I gave a few interviews, always emphasizing the same points. Know your bylaws, document everything, and don't be afraid to push back against illegal demands. A state representative even contacted me about potential legislation to increase oversight of HOAs in Connecticut. I met with her in Hartford and shared my experience, along with stories from other homeowners who'd faced similar issues. She's working on a bill that would require HOAs to register with the state, submit to regular audits, and provide homeowners with better mechanisms to challenge board decisions. Marcus still laughs about the case. He says it's his favorite in 20 years of practice because the facts were so absurd and the outcome so clearly just. He's used it in presentations about HOA law, always changing the names but keeping the core story. Never underestimate how far someone will go over a bag of salt. The settlement money went into savings, most of it. I did splurge on one thing, though. A professional-grade ice melt spreader that can clear my entire driveway in 10 minutes. It felt appropriate somehow, a monument to the battle fought over winter preparation. Life in Pinewood Estates is quieter now. The new HOA board meets monthly, posts minutes online, and actually seeks input before making decisions. Violations are issued rarely and only for legitimate issues. The community feels more like a community and less like a fiefdom. I still see some of the people who supported Brenda during the lawsuit. It's awkward sometimes, passing them on the street or at the grocery store. A few have apologized, saying they didn't understand the full situation. Others avoid eye contact. That's fine. I didn't go through all of that to win popularity contests. What matters is that the next person who faces an unreasonable HOA demand in Pinewood Estates has a precedent to point to. They can say, "Remember what happened with Lucas Lancaster. Remember what happened to Brenda Whitmore." And maybe, just maybe, that will be enough to prevent the same abuse from happening again. The Connecticut HOA community has changed too. Other boards heard about Brenda's conviction and started reviewing their own practices. Insurance companies began requiring more documentation and oversight. A few particularly aggressive HOAs backed off from questionable enforcement actions rather than risk similar lawsuits. I've become an accidental advocate, which wasn't something I ever intended or particularly wanted. But when people reach out asking for advice on fighting their own HOA battles, I help where I can. I share Marcus's contact information, explain what worked in my case, and always emphasize the importance of documentation. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just given Brenda the salt that first day. If I'd handed over a few bags, would any of the rest have occurred? Would she still have been exposed for embezzlement? Would the bylaws have been reformed? Would $30,000 in stolen funds have been recovered? I don't think so. Giving in to unreasonable demands just encourages more unreasonable demands. Brenda wasn't after salt for the community. She was after submission. She wanted me to acknowledge her authority to take whatever she wanted, and she would have used that precedent against me and everyone else at every opportunity. The salt was never really about salt. It was about power, control, and the willingness to abuse authority for personal satisfaction. Standing up to that cost me months of stress, thousands in legal fees before the settlement, and countless hours dealing with depositions, paperwork, and court appearances. But it was worth it. Patricia Mills told me something at a community barbecue last summer that stuck with me. She said, "You know what Brenda's biggest mistake was? She went after someone who had the resources and stubbornness to fight back. She'd been getting away with smaller abuses for years because people just paid the fines and moved on. But you wouldn't bend, and it unraveled everything." She's right. I had Marcus's legal expertise available through friendship, enough savings to weather the financial stress, and a personality that bristles at unjust authority. Not everyone has those advantages, which is exactly why people like Brenda operate the way they do. They count on most people giving in because fighting is too hard. The whole experience taught me things about community, power dynamics, and the importance of documented evidence that I never expected to learn. It taught me that sometimes doing the right thing means becoming very unpopular with certain people. It taught me that institutions meant to serve a community can be corrupted by individuals who view them as personal kingdoms. Most importantly, it taught me that ordinary people can fight back against institutional bullying and win. But it requires determination, good legal help, and the willingness to endure a lot of discomfort. My life is back to normal now, as normal as it can be after you've spent months locked in legal combat with your HOA president and watched her get arrested for embezzlement. I go to work, maintain my house, prepare responsibly for winter weather, and participate in community events. The difference is that now I pay attention to HOA meetings, read every email and notice carefully, and keep detailed records of all interactions. Trust but verify, as they say. Or in the case of HOAs, maybe just verify. The Pinewood Estates community is healthier for what happened, even though it was painful at the time. We have better bylaws, better oversight, better communication, and a board that actually serves the homeowners rather than ruling over them. That wouldn't have happened without the ice storm, the lawsuit, and everything that followed. Sometimes I think about Brenda in prison, serving her sentence for embezzlement. I don't take pleasure in it exactly, but I don't feel guilty either. She made her choices. She chose to abuse her authority, steal from her neighbors, and escalate a simple disagreement into a federal case. Every step of the way, she could have backed down, apologized, or simply followed the actual rules instead of making up her own. She didn't. And so she lost her position, her reputation, her freedom, and apparently her marriage. All of that ultimately traces back to a February ice storm and her decision that my salt belonged to the community. The young couple who bought her house invited me over for coffee a few months after they moved in. They'd heard the story from other neighbors and wanted to know the truth. I told them everything, showed them the documentation I'd kept, explained the lawsuit and the criminal charges. The husband, Daniel, shook his head in amazement. Over salt. She went to prison over salt. No, I corrected him. She went to prison for embezzling $30,000. The salt just revealed who she really was. His wife, Amanda, asked if I'd do it again, knowing how it would turn out. I thought about that question carefully before answering. Yes, I finally said. Because if I hadn't stood up to her, she'd still be stealing from the HOA, still be bullying homeowners, still be making life miserable for anyone who didn't submit to her authority. The salt was just the beginning. Fighting back exposed all the rest. They seemed satisfied with that answer. We've become friendly since then, occasionally sharing dinner or watching football together. They're part of the new Pinewood Estates, the one that emerged from the ashes of Brenda's regime. I keep a file cabinet in my home office with all the documentation from the lawsuit, receipts, emails, legal filings, depositions, settlement agreement, news articles about the criminal trial. It's 3 inches thick, a paper monument to the most stressful 6 months of my life. I don't look at it often, but knowing it's there is somehow comforting. Evidence matters. Documentation matters. Being able to prove your case matters more than being right, because you can be completely right and still lose if you can't demonstrate it in a way the legal system recognizes. Every winter now, when I buy my salt and ice melt, the guys at the hardware store recognize me. One of them, an older gentleman named Frank, always jokes, "Stocking up for battle, Lucas." The first time he said it, I wasn't sure how to react. Now I just laugh and say, "Just being prepared, Frank." Just being prepared. Being prepared saved me during the ice storm, not just physically, in terms of having what I needed to weather the emergency, but legally and financially too. I had receipts proving my purchases, photos documenting my stockpile, and a clear timeline of events. When Brenda tried to rewrite history and claim I'd stolen community property or violated some imaginary bylaw, I had evidence to refute every claim. That's my advice to anyone facing HOA issues. Document everything. Save every email, photograph every violation notice, record dates and times of conversations, keep receipts for all expenditures. It feels paranoid until you need it, and then it feels like salvation. The settlement included a non-disparagement clause, which technically prevents me from speaking negatively about Brenda or the old HOA board. But it doesn't prevent me from stating facts, and the facts speak for themselves. Brenda Whitmore misappropriated HOA funds, abused her authority as president, attempted to illegally confiscate private property, and was convicted of multiple felonies. Those are matters of public record, not opinions. The clause also doesn't prevent me from speaking about HOA issues generally or sharing my experience as a cautionary tale. I've done 3 interviews with local media. 2 with HOA reform advocates, and 1 with a law school class studying property rights. Each time, I focus on the lessons learned rather than personal attacks on Brenda. The lessons are what matter anyway. HOA board members are not dictators. Bylaws have force of contract law but can't override state and federal statutes. Private property remains private even during emergencies. Authority requires accountability. Communities thrive when governed by consent rather than coercion. These aren't radical concepts, but they were foreign to Brenda's administration. She genuinely believed that being elected HOA president gave her the right to make unilateral decisions, spend money without oversight, and punish anyone who questioned her. That belief system is what ultimately destroyed her. I sometimes wonder if she's reflected on that during her time in prison. Does she understand what she did wrong? Does she recognize that the power she wielded was supposed to be a responsibility, not a weapon? Or does she still see herself as a victim, unfairly persecuted for trying to help the community? I'll probably never know, and honestly, it doesn't matter. What matters is that she can't hurt anyone else in Pinewood Estates, and the systems that allowed her abuses have been reformed. The HOA now operates transparently, with checks and balances, financial oversight, and mechanisms for homeowners to challenge board decisions. That's the real victory. Not the settlement money, not Brenda's conviction, but the lasting change to how our community is governed. Dozens of families will live in Pinewood Estates over the coming decades, and they'll benefit from reforms that grew out of my refusal to hand over salt during an ice storm. When I tell people that story, they often laugh at the absurdity of it. Salt. Such a mundane thing to spark such dramatic consequences. But history is full of small things that became symbols of larger conflicts. Tea in Boston Harbor, a bus seat in Montgomery, a salt tax in British India. My 40 bags of ice melt were just the latest in a long tradition of ordinary objects becoming extraordinary through the conflicts that surrounded them. The ice storm of February 2025 will be remembered in Ridgefield for the damage it caused, the power outages that lasted days in some areas, and the trees that had to be removed all over town. In Pinewood Estates specifically, it will also be remembered as the storm that brought down Brenda Whitmore and transformed our HOA from a source of frustration into a functional community organization. Not everyone sees it that way, of course. There are still people who think I should have just shared my supplies, that I caused unnecessary conflict over something trivial, that Brenda's punishment was too severe for what amounted to poor judgment during a stressful situation. I understand that perspective even if I don't agree with it. But those people didn't face the choice I faced. Submit to an illegal demand and set a precedent that the HOA could take whatever it wanted whenever it claimed an emergency, or stand firm on principle and endure whatever consequences followed. I chose principle, and I'd make the same choice again. The story has taken on a life of its own in local HOA communities. I've heard variations of it repeated back to me with details changed or exaggerated. In some versions, I had hundreds of bags of salt. In others, Brenda tried to physically take them from my garage. One particularly creative retelling had me installing security cameras that caught her trying to steal supplies in the middle of the night. None of that happened, but I understand the impulse to embellish. Good stories grow in the telling, especially when they tap into common frustrations. Almost everyone in an HOA has dealt with overzealous enforcement, questionable fines, or board members who seem drunk on their tiny amount of power. My story resonates because it's their story too, just amplified. The reality was less dramatic than the legends but more complex. It involved months of stress, difficult decisions about how far to push legal action, and genuine uncertainty about whether fighting back would make things better or worse. The happy ending wasn't guaranteed. I could have lost the lawsuit, been stuck with massive legal fees, and had a lien placed on my house. But I had good legal advice, solid documentation, and a case with clear facts in my favor. Plus, frankly, luck. If Brenda hadn't been embezzling funds, if the audit hadn't revealed her financial mismanagement, if she hadn't made so many enemies on the board and in the community, the outcome might have been different. Success in these situations requires preparation meeting opportunity meeting determination. I prepared by documenting everything and hiring good counsel. Opportunity came when Brenda's other abuses were revealed. Determination meant seeing the fight through even when it would have been easier to settle for less or walk away. Now, almost a year and a half after that ice storm, life in Pinewood Estates feels stable and positive. The HOA functions smoothly under Patricia Mills's leadership. Community events are well attended. People take pride in the neighborhood without feeling oppressed by arbitrary rules. It's what an HOA should be: a tool for maintaining property values and community standards, not a vehicle for personal power. I've started serving on an HOA advisory committee, helping review proposed bylaw changes and assess new policies. It's volunteer work, unpaid and sometimes tedious, but it feels important. I lived through what happens when HOAs go bad. Now I can help ensure it doesn't happen again, at least not here. The ice melt in my garage will get used this winter, spread on my driveway and sidewalk during whatever storms come our way. It's just salt, frozen water treatment, a commodity you can buy at any hardware store. But it will always represent something more to me: the line between reasonable governance and authoritarian overreach, the importance of standing up for property rights, and the surprisingly high cost of refusing to be bullied. Brenda Whitmore demanded my salt supply during an ice storm. I refused. She sued me. She lost everything. And Pinewood Estates became a better place because someone finally said no to a petty tyrant who thought her title meant she owned the neighborhood. That's the story. Simple in its bones, complex in its details, and hopefully instructive to anyone else facing similar battles with their HOA or any other institution that has forgotten its purpose is to serve, not to rule.